this is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute in conjunction with the Keshe Foundation Canadian Educational Team. I have to do some business, Mark, please. You did it already, but I have to do it again.
If you'd like, I can play it unless you want to read it yourself.
No, let me read it because that allows me to clear my throat and get everything warmed up. So please enjoy the trip today. We're going to have a nice trip. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding of dialogue against processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for healthcare professionals' clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional, medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, or listeners should always consult their physicians or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. Please, we specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantabilities or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided as is and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. So every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek medical advice or consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to. I want to thank all the participants from the North American Corona team, from the Keshe Foundation US team, and we want to thank also, as part of the North American team, the Keshe Foundation Corona Mexican educational team. But this is not restricted to North America. I want to welcome all the members of the international community that have come here and made this Sunday program such a success. We are trying to teach the modern plasma science as laid out by Marin Tevakoli Keshe. And as such, what we've been trying to do is to present the plasma understanding and have a basic understanding, basic knowledge, and basic understanding. And so today, this is a presentation of Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute. We're going to be talking about the Z-axis because we're Canadian. But anyway, my name is Alexander and I am from Canada. It's April the 11th, 2021. And this is the Keshe Foundation Canada Plasma Education Series. And we have been discussing in the past 21 classes, which we broke down into basic teaching, which identified a lot of the terminology that we're going to use and we want to use so that we can communicate properly. And I'm quite pleased that we're able to do that because we're seeing the information flowing more than having to contend with the mechanics of what we're talking about. So that gives a chance to do a little bit more intermediate teaching and then move on to advanced teaching, the total of which was 21 classes, all of which really is just a basic teaching. We are now faced with having to expand on that understanding, and this is my little effort to try and bridge that gap, because we will be having an enormous number of new people joining our teaching. And we have to remember that we are adding to the knowledge. We are a Spaceship Institute, and we're adding to the knowledge. So we don't want to throw the old knowledge away. What we want to do is add to it. And in order to do that, we do have to acknowledge it and introduce the new terminology, which is all related to charges in motion. Energy is in motion, and as such, it has a charge, and it goes through various geometries and dimensions. And this is where we find there's a certain dynamism which is not recognized in the old science. So we have to look at the new science, and the new science involves new terminology. And so we got an opportunity to identify what is principal matter. Excellent introduction today on amino acids and a precursor for star formations. I introduced a subject of plasma rotation and dynamic plasma. And we have some new words that are being bandied about, which we say residue and conversion. And we'll get a chance to talk about more of that and introduce it into our lexicon. Natural plasma terminology involves basic, very basic transmission, transition, and transmutation. We identify this in conventional science as the x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis, and they have a relationship. The x is the rotation, the y has to do with the poles. The z-axis, which is what we're going to talk about today, involves field strength, and this is what plasma is all about. So the field strength starts at a core. That core is seeking a position. And why is it seeking a position? Because that core has to interact with other plasmas. And the combination of these plasmas create a dynamism, which is an interaction. And then the combination of those creates a dynamic plasma. And so today being Sunday, twice a day, we try and improve the quality of the peace dome, which we do through spraying of the GANS water twice a day around the world, and having the plasma energies link up and handshake together and form a peace dome around the world. And the reason that's possible is because energy is in motion and our souls carry that energy. And so we see that we have various geometries that we can follow. And so today we're looking at one of those geometries, the z-axis. The last 2 weeks we discussed the x and the y-axis. And we find that there's an interaction with our emotions. And so our emotions have an effect, which is more or less a co-creation. And so we're discussing creation, a co-creation, and a procreation. And then we have to question, which range are we talking about? And if we deal with different energy levels, then we somehow have to be able to transcend these various levels. So these are all the skills that we have to learn. As we discussed in book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matters. And this is what we're going to focus on, because when we all came here was because of the plasma science, the cups of life, and what does it mean? And it was all fun and games, except, now things are getting serious. We have to understand the creation of the universe. And why do we have to understand the creation of the universe? So the basic thing is that it exists from energy. And so energy has a charge, and that charge is in motion. And energy is always in motion. We can't contain it. We can't keep it. But so when we look at the picture on the front cover of the book number 1, we see how the energies come together. We'll discuss that. But we look at the picture on the right, and we find that the energies also interact with other fields. And so there's a duality there. But before we want to review, because there are new members in the audience, there are mature students as well. Refreshing doesn't hurt, but they're also teachers. And this is one of the things that we need to emphasize. We do need more teachers. So everyone teaches in their own way. The thing is that we have to be clear in our dialogue and understand that the terminology is really important. So when we talk about matter, we have to understand that if energy is in motion, somehow it manifests into a matter state. And what is this matter? So we have a small m matter, which is the old science, and that is very physical. We have a capital M matter, which is the new science, and that is not physical. But both of these matters manifest. And so how they manifest is called binding. But manifestation is also creation. So we could actually say that energy binding is creation. But we have 2 matter plasmas. So we said that one is physical because we can touch it and see it. And for us, for most of us, that's all that matters. But in the matter plasma, we cannot touch it, we cannot see it, but we can sense it. And so with this matter, we really should call it light matter because it conveys light and light conveys mass, which we found out. And so how does this move? And so there has to be a creation of principal matter. And this principal matter comes from the transfer of energy via PM ticks. So PM ticks are floating all throughout the universe. They're floating within our immediate uh, range, which is on this planet. And so these force fields interact, and when they have a balance, they create a maggrav condition. But you see, we have to figure out what is our point of view. And I think for a lot of us, this becomes a very confusing thing because we have a lot of different schools of thought. And basically, we're talking about being able to transition various energy strengths. But, the thing is that we are also preoccupied in our life with the transmission of energies. And so the way we transmission is either by transmission lines, by computers, by Wi-Fi, by radio, TV, and of course, through verbal and auditory communications. So all sorts of ways that we can transmit. But now we're finding out that we can do this at various energy states. And then, of course, we find out that we have to take into account the relationship with this planet. And then we also find out that there are things that are missing. And so we find really we have a lot of skills to learn and not to be dismayed because we have a basis of understanding. When we're creating this principal matter, it is a combination of the antimatter, dark matter, and the matter. And if we can change this and understand that we have a principal matter, which migrates to light matter. And so in between, we have transition or transmission energy. And this is what we're very, very familiar with, right? And we've been calling the transmission the x-axis and the transition the y-axis. But, when these energies come together, they create a component. That basic component is the structure of the neutron. And when we talk about advanced science, we usually talk about neutron decay. In the plasma science, we talk about neutron growth. This core component is actually gravitational. And so let's look at how that works in our life. So the fundamental compound or molecule that we have on this planet is a water molecule. And that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at water, which is H2O. And one of the reasons that water is a natural solvent and a universal solvent is because it shears off an electron very, very easily. That electron is actually called a hydrogen. And so that is an energy that is taken off the water. And when it happens, what's left behind is a hydroxyl. And so our H2O becomes a H1O, OH, plain and simple. But there's a relationship between the hydrogen and the oxygen, and it still maintains its hydroxyl relationship because it maintains a magnetical gravitational relationship. And so it is, although it is negatively charged because it's missing a hydrogen, it is still a maggrav. So it has a tolerance. It has the range that it can operate in. But within that range is gravitational, is feeding the magnetical. We wonder if, because there's an infinity loop, how does the energy go from the magnetical back to the gravitational? Can it come back through the same dimension? Can it come back through the same axis? Well, try going down the wrong way on a one-way street and you'll answer that question. So there has to be some kind of accommodation for this energy to go both ways. And if the basic rule is the higher strength feeds the weaker strength, how does it happen that the weaker gets back to the higher? And is that all we have to take into account? So the thing is, when we were looking at shearing the hydrogen electron off of the water molecule, and we found that the water molecule and the water itself is a natural solvent. So the hydroxyl being negative is looking to meet up with anything else, and very easily. And so we could meet up with dirty dishes, or we could meet up with a dirty car, or we could meet up with a thirsty person or a thirsty plant. And this is how water is becoming a universal solvent for us. But we lost the hydrogen, and where did it go? And so we don't know where it went, but we do know that it went somewhere and that it had its own component. And what is interesting about this component is that it is constructed from an electron and a proton, and it is missing something. It is missing the neutron. And how is that possible? So we find that it is able to maintain a mag-grav position because the proton is gravitational and the electron is magnetical. So there is a force field. And we find that there is an infinity loop that keeps the two together. So from conventional science, we know that the electron and the proton are a marriage made in physics. And somehow this hydrogen is now looking to go somewhere and interact somewhere. And the thing is that it has a collective energy, a collective of the electron and the proton combination. And so it is from that interaction point, which is literally the balance point between the electron and the proton, is the interaction point. And so that becomes the core component. And so that is now looking for some kind of gravitational core component. So we find when two forces come together, unlike what happens in man, when two forces come together and they engage to the point of bloodshed, when two identical forces come together, if they are of the same polarity, they will repel. But if they are of the same common field force, they will come together. And so that becomes the beginning of the x-axis. And so the hydrogen is representative of the PM ticks that are flying through space, and they're looking for a home, and space is full of PM ticks. Energy is always flowing. And as it comes together, it forms the x-axis. And as it builds, it introduces the y-axis. So you now have a two-dimensional base of operations. But the energy keeps coming, and so we build the third dimension. That's what we're talking about today, the z-axis. And so to maintain the z-axis, because energy is always in motion, you have to provide a path. So there's a rotating field as made by the x-axis, but is it only made in one plane? And so we find that it's not, because the z-axis is spherical. So the z-axis is showing the rotation in all different directions. And this is all rotating around the poles. And so the question becomes, with the poles, are they only coming out of the North Pole and the South Pole? Well, these questions come to be answered when we look at the structure of plasma. And as you can see, there is no delineation, there's no differentiation here. We know there's a plasma at the core and that it creates a force field unlike a structure. And so to maintain this force field, we have to know that the energy is flowing. And to keep that energy flowing, it has to go around and around, because we cannot stop it. And when that energy keeps going around and around, for some reason, somehow, well, that energy becomes a dynamic plasma. And what a dynamic plasma is something that goes beyond the physical boundary. Or let's put it another way, it's something that goes beyond the manifested boundary, the manifestation of matter. So when we look at the original reactors that we were building, they were physical. And we put them in a star formation, and they had electric motors. And we filled them each with GaNs. And when we rotated them, they created a plasma field. But what we found is when we brought all of them together, they created a dynamic plasma. And we noticed that, and we're going to discuss that more later on. But what we found was that there was a rotating field with around each position. There was a transition going from the gravitational base to the magnetical top. And we found that the rotating balls were in a small antimatter state, which was physical. We put GANs in the balls, which was physical. We created a rotating plasma state, which was plasmatic. And we created a force field that went beyond the manifestation of the matter, which we call the dynamic plasma state, which obviously is plasmatic. And so we actually were witnessing 4 different plasma states within the range on this planet. Well, if we can do that on this planet, maybe we can do it anywhere. Well, maybe the we is not what we need to be talking about, because when we look into space, we see that this knowledge has already been available. It's just that we're now tuning in. And so what happens is that our knowledge is interacting with other knowledge. And as we expand the knowledge and we bring the two together, then we ask ourselves, are we bringing these two fields back to back or head to head? Which way is up? Which way is down? Which dimension are we operating in? Too many questions, not enough answers. So let's review what we did through dimension building. And we found that as we built individual dimensions up, that we had multiple points within these dimensions. And there is a kind of relationship to something that we can all be now familiar with. We start with our single point, which is the Earth. I mean, that's our home. Isn't that our home? And in that home, we make our environment. So we find that different nationalities, different parts of our home, the Earth, have different environments. And as a result, we have different cultures and different feeding systems. But all of them come from the interaction of plasma. And so basically, and I mean basically, we've been discussing nano and GANs, and we're trying to progress to the field dimensions of plasma and dynamic plasma. So what is instructive and is that the rules in the physicality are the same as the rules in the plasma. However, the dynamism and the activity and the way the activity works is totally different. And so we are restricted by a lot of things. And one of the things we're restricted by is the scientific community, where it has neatly organized this periodic table of elements. And so we find that the ability to absorb the energy is determined by the number on the periodic table of elements. So the higher the number, the more the energy is retained. And we find that as we retain more energy, we have more neutrons. And as we have more neutrons, we have more mass. But if we take a little bit closer look at this periodic table of elements, we find that it is sequentially done in an arithmetic fashion. In other words, it's 1 by 1 by 1. So we started with the hydrogen, which is 1, and we have carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, which is 6, 7, and 8. 2 other elements are copper and zinc, which are 29 and 30. And what does that number refer to? And we know that is referring to the number of protons. And interestingly enough, that equals the number of neutrons, except for hydrogen, which doesn't have a neutron, but we talk about that later at another class. The thing is that we now have, and we know that a proton has 1 electron. So people are asking, why is it carbon 6? And why do we refer to that as carbon 12? Well, what the 12 refers to is the number of electrons. Well, wait a second. we have a proton with an electron, so that's one electron, and then we have the nitrogen. Well, the question is, where did the other hydrogen come from? Because the hydrogen is another electron. So that's an interesting question. So we find the limitation of the periodic table of elements is limited because it's dealing in small m matter state. Well, if I say small m matter state, we do understand that we have nuclear physics. And so that's a little bit more advanced. Our problem as humanity, of course, when we get a bigger toy, we want to break it. So that's not creation. Well, it is creation. It's a destruction. So destruction is a form of creation. So I digress. We have a new capability that's coming, and this is to detect manifestation. So we said manifestation can be done with a small m matter or a capital M matter. And so once we get this plasma detection of manifestation settled away, we have a lot of work to do to take care of the factors that are non-apparent, non-visible in the obvious. So we have to understand at all times that there are relationships. So when we're discussing something, there has to be a reference, a relationship. And so when we're discussing plasma science, there's a magnetical gravitational relationship. And so to create a plasma field, you have to have a balance, and that we call a maggraph. But we have a scientific community with self-imposed limitations. We also have a spiritual community with self-imposed limitations. And what keeps these two apart is terminology. And so now we have a plasma science with a new terminology. So what we want to do is we want to combine the scientific with the spiritual and add to the knowledge. And part of the results of the plasma is understanding the manifestation of matter. And part of the results of the manifestation of matter is the manifestation of cells. And so we have trillions of cells within our body, which are part and parcel of the whole, and they operate by the same rules. And there's a conversion of energy. And so we see in the matter, we call that the light matter. And we'll see in our souls an animation, a spirituality. I'm sorry, we see in our cells a spirituality and an animation. That is the soul. So what we're looking at is another word, the conversion of light and with respect to our soul. These are all relationships. And the basic relationship that we see as a physicality in our existence is the amino acid. And so if we looked at these magnets and we see three magnets back to back and how they're attracted to each other, we understand that the energy goes from one side to the other. But in this case, they're in balance. And so that is a maggraph. And we have an opposite pole in the middle, which causes the attraction. And so each one of these magnets has a flow on the y-axis, but collectively together, there is a field around it. And we can't see it, but we know that it's there, because if we pull these magnets apart and we're not careful, they'll come back together. And if we have our fingers in between, we will feel pain when they pinch our fingers. But in the plasma science, we have energy flowing in a different manner. And so we have what's called the plasmatic air, because the energy comes and forms a plasmatic nitrogen in the atmosphere, which combines with the plasmatic hydrogen in the atmosphere, and it creates a plasma amino acid, which then manifests itself as what we call the nitrogen, the hydrogen, the carbon, and the oxygen. And so this is the basis of the amino acid. Well, the precursor to the DNA is the amino acid. And so from there, the DNA begins. So that begins after the creation of the amino acid. And so we find that the transmission of energy, the way we're familiar with respect to rotation, with respect to the environment, with respect to the earth, has to do with our transcription process. And so the DNA is actually a result of the transcription process, and it has to do with consciousness. And so somehow, some way, we know that we still have an unconsciousness, because when people are in a coma, they are able to maintain their DNA transcription. And so there is a force that is still doing that and still contributing to that. And I mentioned methionine here because that's the initiator of the DNA, and that's not something we're going to talk about today, but it has to do with the initiator of the protein structure of the DNA. And this is in reference to the class that Mark started with today. But carrying on, we introduced RNA, which is in the y-axis, and the combination of those two was referencing transition, the transition going into non-physical transcription. In other words, this was transcription that was done prior to the formation of the physicality. In other words, the transcription of the substructure which carried the information to our unconsciousness. And we call that the karma, because that's our carry forward. So we can carry forward to our RNA, and we can carry forward from our DNA as well. So this is one of the reasons we have a lot of emphasis on the ethos of the universe, and we're going to discuss that more and more as we go along, because our basic genes are working with respect to the RNA-DNA interaction. But in our society here, we have a lot of therapies and modifications and what I reference as gene mutilation. And fortunately, we have a new science that is actually giving us a plasma science restoration. So when we look at the basic amino acid, it forms the DNA. And from there, we start to link up. And as we link up these amino acids, they start to fold over into proteins. And then they create a chain, and these become fatty acids. And these fatty acids have a capability of folding and opening, or in other words, opening and closing. And these fatty acids then come together in teams and link at the head and create a hydrophilic head, which is water loving, but it creates a hydrophobic tail. This hydrophobic tail consists of two fatty acids, and it is hydrophobic, which means it's oil loving, and they link up tail to tail. And so they actually circumnavigate a cell, and this is the structure of a cell. And so we find that there is a magnetical relationship with respect to the outside. There's a magnetical and gravitational relationship with respect to the inside. And then there's a transition layer in between. And so somehow, some way, the energy has to go from the inside to the outside. Not only that, but it also has to communicate with all the phospholipids around the cell. So the communication with the phospholipids is transmission, and the information from the inside to the outside is transition. However, the structure of the cell somehow has to communicate with the basic DNA-RNA combination within the cell, and then it has to have a life. And in order to have that life, it has to go through a transmutation where it's able to exchange energy in a different dimension. And so this dimension becomes the X, the combination of the X, Y, and resides in the Z axis, which is the totality of the plasma field. And so this becomes the principal interaction. When energy is always in motion, and what is different about plasma science is that this energy is in a two-way street. But is it two-way on the one-way street, or is it two-way on two separate streets? Or is it in different dimensions, or is it different energy states? So these are all part of the skills that we have to learn. But basically, we can see in the left-hand picture that energy is interacting between two MAGRAV fields. But in order for these MAGRAV fields to be MAGRAV fields, they have to maintain their field force. So the basic MAGRAV field force is in balance. There is an excess of energy, which is an exchange of energy with other field forces. So each MAGRAV has a plasma condition, and the interaction of the fields is a dynamic plasma condition. And then other things happen. So we find that things grow. And one of the phenomena I found was with concrete and how it grows, and it has an interaction with, oh, there's that natural solvent again, water. You add water to cement powder and it starts to hydrate. And basically the water interacts with the cement powder and it hydrates from the outside. It creates an envelope, kind of like the coronavirus, and it works its way in. And when the water, because it's exchanging energy, gets consumed, it has to be replenished. So the concrete will continue to grow in the presence of water. So therefore, the absence of water stops the growth. And this is done in matter state. So that's where the limitation comes in, you see. But the thing about it is that not only does the concrete hydrate, but it starts to grow spikes. These spikes are growing perpendicular to the surface. And, you know, it's kind of funny because when you look at a snail and how it grows, and it is made from basically calcium, but this calcium is made underwater. And as you see how the snail is growing, it grows in a rotating fashion. Well, the spikes on the concrete particles, the hydration envelopes, also grows in a rotating fashion. And the way they grow and the strength that they have is due to the rotating field, which is facilitating the growth. And this would explain how plants have long, thin stems and they seem to sway in the wind without breaking, unless that wind is extremely excessive. And so we find that there is a rotation with respect to the growth. But as you can see on the markings on the shell, that there are striations across the shell. And so the snail itself is growing this in another rotating action. So there's a rotating action to grow the shell, and the growth of the shell is growing in a rotating axis. So it's a rotation within a rotation. Well, this is kind of strange. So when we look at our nerves and we find that there's a neuron on one head and dendrites on the other head, on the other side, and this is a representation of an axon. And in between, we have different myelin sheaths, and these myelin sheaths are created through a rotating action. In other words, the sheath is growing in a rotating fashion. And the way the sheath grows on the leading edge is in a rotating fashion. Oh, here's another rotation within a rotation. Isn't that interesting? And then each myelin sheath is formed, and that has a magnetical gravitational connection. And then there is a flow of energy somehow that goes from the neuron to the dendrites. And then from the dendrites, there's a synaptic gap that goes to Oh, another neutron, another neuron. So, and this is how the energy is transmitted. Okay, well, do you see the similarity to a fatty acid? We find that there's a balance of the fatty acid along the chain structure, but from the left to the right, there is a flow, kind of like on the neuron. And isn't that interesting? How about when we compare that to a nanocoating? And we find that what we've done is we've gone from a chain-like structure, which is resembling the small m matter state as shown on the periodic table of elements, to a monatomic structure, which is not shown on the periodic table of elements because we're dealing with plasma elements. However, it still is in the matter state. And so we have a higher energy state we call nanocoating, which is in physicality. And so here we are. We have three things, all different: a nerve, a nanocoated copper wire, and a fatty acid. And they're all built the same way. And then we have another strange thing. We found that the snail had a smooth surface, but this seashell has points on it, spikes. And these spikes are growing also perpendicular to the surface, like the cement particle. So it's growing spikes. And isn't that interesting? So we have a rotating field growing from a rotating field, growing from a rotating field. So we could say that the x-axis, which is rotating around the y-axis, which is rotating, which is around the z-axis, which is rotating, and it's creating a dynamic plasma condition. So this is insight, a first insight into how the soul is growing. So we see that there is a combination of the unconsciousness and consciousness. And for, I'm saying, the majority of us, we're having an awareness coming, and we need to have an acceptance. Okay, just like when we go from and change our diets, we have to go through a customization process, just like when we change our climate, go from the hot to the cold or the cold to the hot, we have to adjust. This adjustment is acceptance, the acceptance of our awareness. So our awareness comes from the learning, and then the learning is a field force. And it is this, everyone can learn, but will they know? And then the question comes, if you look at, say, a litter of cats, and let's say the mom passes away while the babies are still young kittens, and I'm talking about, let's say a week or two old, where do they learn their adaptance to the environment? So there has to be some kind of knowing, and that knowing is by connection. And so we are awakening to these new ways of learning. And as we awaken to this, we develop a maturing. So maturing actually becomes the elevation of our growth. And that's the whole purpose of life. You see, life is for growing. And when you look at things that grow, you understand that those are sentient beings. So we find that the vertical people and the horizontal people have awareness, and they have sensitivity. And so these are all connected by carbon. And so are we. We're part of the horizontal people. We walk vertically, but we sleep horizontally. And we are organic. Organic means carbon-based. Interestingly, we have concrete, which is silicon based and meaning inorganic, and it can grow. So the concrete, being silicon based, is also a sentient being. In order to be a sentient being, whether you're organic or inorganic, you have to have a soul. And so that's the point. When we're looking at relationships, we can't just look at the singularity and say, well, here's my neutron. And we can't just look at the duality and say, well, here's my electron proton. We have to look at the trinity, the neutron, the electron, and the proton. But if we're looking at that, then we're not any of that. We're in another dimension. And so that becomes the question all the time. What is our field reference? Where are we operating in? So in order to maintain a context, we have to establish a relationship. So that relationship falls within a range. And this is what we have to figure out. So plasmatically, a magnetical gravitational range creates a balanced position, which we call a maggrav. And scientifically speaking, we have a range in the magnetical fields, and we also have a range of energy and motion. And so science has been trying to grapple with this conservation of magnetical fields versus the conservation of energy. Spiritually, we have various schools, and I won't go through them, but basically spirituality is supposedly tied in with our soul. Well, the thing is that neither is satisfactory in answering our questions. So we bring the two together and we call this plasma science, and this adds to the knowledge. And our knowledge basically that we're looking in our basic three dimensions, which is the X, Y, and Z axis, and we say that's the bringing of the energy. So a lot of people have been exercising a lot of noodle power to try and figure this out. And one of those was a famous Brazilian mathematician named Dino Crespidon. And he said, well, you know what? God is a set of mutually perpendicular lines of force oscillating upon themselves. And so he identified clearly the X, Y, and Z axis. And when we look at the way energy flows, it flows along a path. And so when we talked about the x-axis, which is kind of the rotating field, we find that it can only go so far. And if we want to get from here to there, we actually have a bend in the road. And then to go to the other part, we have another bend in the road. So in this diagram, we have a representation of the x-axis, and then we had the y-axis, and we can't go through the same road because we would have an axis. So we have to choose another road, reposition our orientation. So now we're moving perpendicular on the y-axis, and we need to get to the other side. So the x-axis and the y-axis both leave the same spot and arrive at a different spot together, but they go through different paths. So what happens to the z-axis? Well, it has to go on another dimension. It can't go through these two dimensions. So what it does is it picks the z-axis perpendicular to the x and the y-axis, and it goes through a different path. So now we have our three dimensions, and we find that we have to go through a crooked road to go through a straight line. Isn't that interesting? But there's a problem here, and that problem is that we have a residue. We have supposedly a structure, and we have taken three paths, and we have not taken everything in account, which makes that structure. And so, we have a residue. And so this becomes actually a mathematical residue. And this is what a lot of scientists have to grapple with. And The fact of the matter is, though, that when we look at the periodic table of elements, we do find that there is a kind of plasma positioning. And if it's on the faces of the cube, we call that face centering. And if it's within the center of the cube, that is body centering. So we find the energy is flowing in, around, and out, following these paths. And if we just do a little plasma repositioning, we see the common hexagonal creation that we find with respect to most of the organic substances on this planet, with the plasmatic field in the center. And so we can do that by slight rotation on the x-axis, or we can do that by pole flipping on the y-axis. And so we can relate this to our Earth because it rotates so that the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west, and the energy goes out to North Pole and comes in the South Pole. But not only. That's just the basic three-dimensional geometry. And so there's something missing. And so the question becomes, in the definition, does oscillating mean frequency? And we'll talk about that another time. The point is that as we look at the plasma energy, the higher strength feeding the weaker energy, now we question which path does it follow, because we've allowed three paths. And then when we have the Magrav condition, we find that the balance between the magnetical gravitational field acts as a giver and a taker. And then the question becomes, giving to what and taking from where? And the answer is, it's coming from the universe. The energy is traveling all over the place in all different directions. And this energy is an energy pack that is looking for a home. And when you create the path, you get the energy. The creation of the energy is through absorption. That's the attraction. That's the gravitational attraction. But before you can attract this energy, you have to emit this energy. That is the magnetical repulsion. So you emit before you absorb. So you emit the energy out, you absorb the energy in. To retain the energy within the Magrav condition, it has to go around. If we cannot maintain that energy, or if we do not have the energy field that is compatible, which we call susceptibility, that energy will go right through. So our range of operating with these energy paths is between the magnetosphere and the ground, which is the range on this Earth. And then within our bodies, well, you see, our bodies are not X, Y's, and Z axes in linear fashion. We are all kind of a little bit more round. And so the x-axis, we said, is the rotating field, and this is a plasma field, which we cannot see with the naked eye. But we see the y-axis is the polar axis, and today we've been talking about the z-axis. And so the question becomes, is how big is the z-axis? Well, I don't know. How big is large? And I always say that because that all depends on the field strength. And that all depends if we're growing or if we're decaying, or if we're just being in a catalytic condition. And so we have an opportunity with these rotating fields to do all three. The possibilities exist. So something is always something as opposed to being something else. And the determining factor, of course, is the susceptibility. So interestingly enough, when we look at galaxies and we see how they're formed, and it's interesting, we're only seeing, to say interesting, because we're only seeing the matter state, which is the form artifact of the matter manifestation. Well, what is the plasmatic manifestation which creates this galaxy? So what we do know is that there's a rotating field that creates the z-axis. And we know that this rotating field is fully three-dimensional and is spherical, because we see how the plants grow. So here's a water hyacinth, which we know it has hairy roots, it has bulbous leaves, and it has spiky flowers. Isn't that interesting? It has 3 different types of matter manifestation within the range, where it is actually some of the parts are below the water and some of the parts are above the water. And there's a height differential as well. And of course, this is the same with terrestrial plants. But, we're not a terrestrial plant. We can walk around. And so we find the way that we manifest our physicality is because we have an ability to translate and manifest this plasmatic energy in various different directions. So we have arms and feet, and we have a head, and we have a capability of moving. And so, how is this possible? We have to take into account and review what a Tesla unit is. And this is a magnetic induction unit. And the symbol T is this unit. And we call it a unit of magnetic flux density. So a magnetic field of 1 Tesla is considered to be very strong. So we did an experiment and we found that we achieved 92 Tesla. So what you're looking at in the blue meter there is the representation of the magnetic flux density of the X, Y, and Z axis. And you can see that the Z axis is at 92 Tesla. And we suddenly, and I mean suddenly, within less than a second, we developed a magnetical creation. And we had a breakthrough. And that breakthrough was 129 Tesla. So unlike the periodic table of elements, which goes arithmetically one after the other with respect to the density, with respect to the gravitational field force, with respect to the number of neutrons, which is attracting the other electrons, which is increasing the mass, this jumped. There was a gap. There was a massive, massive jump. And we didn't have any tsunamis or earthquakes or anything as a result of that. It was strictly a magnetical reaction. And so now we understand how we operate as a plasma being. And we understand how the plasma feeds our soul and how our soul feeds our body. This is all part and parcel of the plasma soul feeding. And we have a lot to learn with respect to how the feeding system is operating and how it is affecting our society. So the reality of it is that these dimensions that we're talking about, we're none of these dimensions. And what are we? So, are we the residue? And we'll have to talk about that next week, because what we want to emphasize is that we're talking about the manifestation of reality, and that is when 2 forces come together, they form another. Unlike armies are obsolete. The formation of any field is a manifestation, you see. And so the plasma feeding leads to this manifestation, and this manifestation can be non-tangible or tangible, non-visible or visible, plasmatic or physical. But there is a plasmatic reality and a physical reality. There is no physical reality without a plasmatic reality. The manifestation is a form artifact, and we're not specifying which reality. And the emotion is of presence is a form artifact of this energy in motion, and we're not specifying which form artifact either. Plasma energy has to do with magnetical field forces of attraction and repulsion. That is the simple explanation. We create a magnetical field, and from that we create a gravitational field. The giving and taking balance of this magnetical gravitational field is a maggrav, and that field then does giving and taking. But we're going to modify this now because this is a little bit more advanced. So we understand that we have a MAGRAPH basis. We have to have a MAGRAPH basis because we wouldn't have a field without it. So when we bring these three fields together, which is the X, Y, and Z axis, we create an attraction, repulsion, balance, which we call a MAGRAPH. So what makes it magnetical? Well, there's an extra energy. So when we talk about magnetical field forces, it is the MAGRAPH plus the magnetical. Conversely, the gravitational is also coming from a MAGRAPH position, which is a balance of the repulsion attraction forces. And if the attraction forces are greater, that makes it gravitational. And so the difference between the balance of the repulsion attraction forces, which is a MAGRAPH, and it becomes gravitational. And this is how we determine the difference between the magnetical and the gravitational. But we need to take into account that we do have a plasmatic substructure of a MAGRAPH condition, which is feeding the manifestation of matter, whether it's physical or not. And so that is the essence of what's behind the cups of life and why we call them the cups of life. When we look at the individual cup, and we look at the first cup, which is a zinc plate and a copper plate and a nano-coated copper coil, we created an interaction of fields, which created a magnetical field. And so that created a gravitational field. And when we looked at the interaction of the nano-coated coil with the zinc plate and the copper coil, we found that we created GANs. This was a higher plasma state, and this GANs happened to be in the cup 1 zinc and copper GANs, and that created a CO2 GANs, which is the connector to the amino acid and the creation of water. And so the same thing happened in the second cup, except that we changed the field strength by introducing a copper plate. But the same thing happened. We had a magnetical field and a gravitational field. And then when we look at the two cups, the relationship between the two cups, one is emotional and one is physical. And there's an interaction of fields with both. We need to keep them at least a meter apart because the dynamic plasma condition transcends the outer boundary of the cup. Can we just take a 10-second break?
No problem, Alex. Maybe you should go a little slower and have a sip of water in between. I can imagine, plus your other teachings and so on. Your voice does get stretched a little bit.
Well, you know, we have a rhythm that is going, and I am teaching to mature students. So the thing is that we have a lot of classes, and I thank you very much for that. Yes, you're absolutely right. But we have to carry on. And so we create a MAGRAPH condition in each of these cups. We have a job, a big job, but you know what? We also have a dividend. And so we're going to call this the virus dividend. We created the one cup for the magnetical field, which is emotional. We created a second cup for the gravitational field, which is physical. And we wanted to deplete the energy from the virus because the virus is an energy pack. And now we understand how energy packs are created and how they flow. But interestingly enough, they are different field sizes. And so now we had to introduce another word, and that is conversion. And so we find that we're not only depleting the energy, but the energy has to be something as opposed to something else. So we're converting it to something else. And that something else happens to be food. Excuse me. When we bring the cups together, it's representative of what we are in terms of physicality. So we have an emotional and a physical context. I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to take a few more seconds.
It's okay.
Hello. We were talking about emotional and physical context, where the emotional is the gravitational, the physical is the magnetical giver, and these create a maggrav condition. That maggrav condition creates a magnetical field, and then, of course, it creates a gravitational field. So this is the point. When we're looking at the basis of the two, when we're looking for heaven, it's right here. It's right here on this earth. And what is it that we're looking for really? We're looking for our soul. And can we find our soul? Well, we at least know where it is. And it's not up and it's not down. It is in. And how do we know that? Well, you see, when we look at the GANs and how it's formed, we find on the left-hand side, when we're looking top down into this glass with the GANs in the bottom, we see the beginnings of a formation of a rotating field. And on the right-hand side, we see the completion of this rotating field where there's nothing there. And where is that nothing? Where did it go? And who did that? And how did that happen? And what does it mean exactly? And so these are the questions that people are going to ask you. Look, what is going on? This is a crazy science. And so you have to be firm and understand that when they ask you to define plasma, tell them plasma is a kind of energy state. And it's important. It will affect our life, you see, because we are plasma beings. We are affecting the physical manifestation. We have a plasmatic manifestation. We have a physical manifestation. We are creating a physical manifestation in 3 dimensions. There is a residue. We are none of those dimensions. Which dimension are we? So we find that we are in a higher state. And so this is the thing. This is the basis of the various plasma rules. And it's just worth reviewing. Energy states increase by at least an order of magnitude, and the higher ones feed the lower ones. But they change. They change through natural creation or natural decay, or they just stay at the same level, being catalysts or non-consuming. But the transfer rates are higher in the plasma state than they are in the matter state by many orders of magnitude. And so the basic characteristics of plasma is it absorbs the field and is a barrier field. However, as we get into the higher fields, we find that the transfer of energy is greater, just like the way the snail built the shell. The more it builds, the bigger it gets, because we have a basis of a manifestation. And so that is part and parcel of the creation. What is the limiting factor? It is the ethos of the universe. Why? Because we are not earthbound. And actually, we're not even spacebound. You see, when we're looking at the old science, we're trying to find out, is it backwards or is it upside down? Well, fortunately, on this earth, we know which way is up because we're sitting on the ground, not on the ceiling. But when we're in outer space, do we know which way is up? And, are we talking about the creation of matter, or are we talking about the origin of the universe? And I guess you could ask, well, which one came first? But that all depends on your point of view and which way you're looking. The thing about it is that we have an opportunity to leave the limitations of the old physics behind. The 2 main limitations was the speed of light and the polar shifting. But we also have spiritual limitations. And so we take the good teachings from the science and spirituality and put it together and drop the limitations behind. So this is where, if we say hello to Socrates, you say, well, if this, then that, and why? Well, that's the answer. So we are self-serving at the expense of others. What does that mean? How is it possible that we can get more by taking from others because they would have less. So by that logic, then the population reduction gives us more. Well, by following that logic, we can say that we become smarter by becoming dumber. Well, I'm trying to teach, and the question is, who becomes smarter? Does the student become smarter, or does the teacher become smarter? And if the student doesn't learn, well, who's the idiot teacher? And this is kind of the question that we have to look at, because when we're looking at the future, we have to look at the new science. We have to look at the corona dividend. We have to look at the plasma dividend. We're in the post-pandemic era, but we have to deal with the present, which is still stuck in the old paradigm. We still have a pandemic out of control, and we still have people arguing that black is blue. Well, Socrates, you know what? You're no longer fun to be around, okay? That was all fun and games and entertainment. We're going to change the channel. We're bringing the Keshe Foundation TV station forward because we have an opportunity where science can meet the soul. And what this will do is bring peace on this planet, because we are now going to be engaging with the plasma science, which isn't limited by the speed of light, but is limited by ethics, because that involves morality, compassion, and courage. And why is that? Is because these are the fundamental aspects of creation, and they follow the universal laws. This is the plasma-bound science, and the universal body enhancement spaceship units will deliver this plasma satisfaction for us through the restoration of our emotional and physical vitality. Isn't that what we're all about? Isn't that what we're wanting all the time? Isn't that what we're doing with our life? This is the determination of the plasma interaction. And we find that all things are working in combination. But now we have to realize the magnetical isn't just pushing. It is pushing to a pulling. And the gravitational isn't just pulling. It's pulling from a pushing. The balance of the pushing and the pulling is a maggrav condition. And we found how we could push and pull for certain dimensions, but we still have a residue. And this is where the new knowledge is taking us. And we don't have enough of that. We need to discuss more of that. So this is what we're doing as teachers. We have to create a pattern. And we have to figure out what is the nature of that pattern, because when we provide that pattern, we get the energy. Is the physical pattern the only pattern that we can do? Is the emotional pattern the only one we can do? How about a soul pattern? How about a plasma pattern? How about ethos of the universe? When we're looking at basic games, and we like to play games, one of the basic games is tic-tac-toe. And what we always want to know is who is the winner. And so here we have a game of tic-tac-toe, but there's something missing. And what is missing is we don't know whose turn is next. And I was promising to answer that question today. And you know what? I lied. How do you like me now? We'll do this next week, because today we're just the messengers of peace and friendship. And we are trying to bring plasma science into the public domain. And to do that, we're asking everybody to sign the World Peace Treaty, once with their pen and once with their heart, because physical and emotional harmony on this planet is only possible if we have physical and emotional vitality. And this is where, as knowledge seekers, we find out the truth. But does that matter? Is that enough? You see, because truth seekers need to be difference makers. It's difference makers who can work with the dynamic plasma. The dynamic plasma state is within us. And that is the universal language throughout, not only us on this planet, with the sun, with our solar system, or the universe. All of it works together. The totality, the plasma science needs to be delivered in exchange for peace on earth. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to make this presentation.